You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, it looks like Donald Trump has failed his first test in front of the Supreme Court. Can you explain what just happened?
Yeah, Brian, let me start by saying any day that the Supreme Court rules against Donald Trump, says no to something Donald Trump wants or demands, that is a good day for the American people, the rule of law, and the Constitution. So let's unpack this one. A couple of weeks ago, Donald Trump, his administration, fired somebody named Hampton Dellinger. Who is Hampton Dellinger? Well, he is in charge of an office that kind of oversees whistleblower complaints, sort of what inspectors general do. They are basically our cops, our watchdog inside government to make sure there's no fraud, waste, abuse, or corruption going on. So, of course, Donald Trump summarily fired him without cause.
Right. The champion fighting against waste, fraud, and abuse fired the one person who was in charge of actually fighting waste, fraud, and abuse. But go on.
Yeah, like the bank robbers getting to fire the FBI agents who are investigating bank robbers.
Right.
So this gentleman, Mr. Dellinger, was put in place in 2024 by Joe Biden for a 5-year term. So he really is not supposed to be fired without cause. There's supposed to be notice to Congress. None of that went on. So Hampton Dellinger went into court and sought a temporary restraining order saying, no, he shouldn't be able to put me out of my job. It is not a lawful termination. And the federal district court judge who caught that case, Carl Nichols, a Trump appointee, initially put a TRO, a temporary restraining order, in place. And the Trump administration instantly appealed it to the D.C. Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, and they ruled 2-1. It was a 3-judge panel. That court ruled that, listen, procedurally, you can't appeal this kind of a temporary restraining order because, in fact, Brian, this one is scheduled to expire on February 26th. But Donald Trump, believing he is the supreme ruler, the king of the universe, the emperor of all things, you can't put even a temporary stop to one of my firings. He said, I don't care about the procedures. I'm trying to get up to the Supreme Court. The good news is the Supreme Court said, no, we're not taking it. Technically, it's not appealable at this point. And here's the thing. There will be more legal proceedings back down in the trial court come February 26th or shortly thereafter. So this is a procedural win for the rule of law. It's a procedural loss for Donald Trump. So I wouldn't take too much away from it. But here is the one thing that I think we can extrapolate that's important, valuable, and good for the health of our democracy. There is, and stick with me, this is going to be a legal breakdown law school class, but just give me 30 seconds on this one. There is a case from 1935, a Supreme Court case called Humphrey's Executor versus the United States, in which the Supreme Court ruled, mind you, almost 100 years ago now, that presidential power to remove officials is not unlimited. There can be some restrictions, and of course there are some restrictions placed by laws that Congress passed. For example, if you want to fire an inspector general, you've got to give Congress 30 days notice and you have to give them a reason, some deficiency in performance that's tied to the work that inspector general was doing. Donald Trump has ignored the federal law, let me put it more pointedly, violated federal law many times over by firing people the moment he took office. So Donald Trump, I believe, and his White House counsel and his legal advisors know that he's violating the law. But here's their goal. Their goal is to get a case up to the Supreme Court and give the Supreme Court the opportunity to expand presidential power. How? By overruling the 100-year-old case of Humphrey's Executor. Let me just give you a little bit of the backstory on that. William Humphreys was an FTC commissioner who was fired by the president because of alleged policy disputes, and he brought suit, but then he died. So his executor stepped in and brought suit to try to get the back pay that they believed was owed to Humphreys because of the wrongful termination. I know that's a lot of detail, but the whole point is Trump is trying to push all of these cases up to the Supreme Court in hopes that the Supreme Court will continue, doing him enormous favors, notwithstanding the federal laws that are in place and notwithstanding the Constitution. that is the real point behind a lot of these illegal firings, in my opinion.
And I'm glad you brought up Humphrey's executor, because that's what I was going to ask you. I mean, that law oversees why the president can't remove the Fed chair, for example. Like that is what insulates the nonpartisan elements of our government, the elements that keep our society functioning without interference from political pressure. And so are we seeing an instance right now where we are poised to see one of these cases that would basically serve as a precedent for all of Humphrey's executor, that would basically determine whether or not Trump could get rid of the Fed chair? He's already done it with the FBI director, for example, who's supposed to serve terms that don't correspond with a presidential term, meaning they're not allowed to fire them. So are we seeing one case that's going to eventually make its way up to the Supreme Court now that would basically determine whether or not Trump does have carte blanche to be able to fire all of these nonpartisan officials who really, again, make society function?
Brian, there is no doubt in my mind that in the coming weeks or months, the Supreme Court will accept review of a case that will revisit the powers of the president to fire people in a completely unlimited, unrestricted way, regardless of laws that have been passed by Congress to give government some continuity and protect at least some functions of government from hyper politicization or nefarious politicization or just plain nefariousness. So I think the Supreme Court, at least the right-wing bloc of the Supreme Court, has probably been champing at the bit to try to revisit the scope of presidential power and perhaps overrule the Humphreys executor case.
Well, Glenn, to that point, does the Supreme Court weighing in here at all, does that give any inkling, any indication of whether or not they might take this case, whether or not they want to delve into this area? Can you read anything from the tea leaves here?
Yeah, Brian, that's the perfect question. And here's why. Because with the Supreme Court saying, listen, this is a preliminary matter. This is a case that is in a very preliminary stage in the trial court, the federal district court, and there have to be more proceedings in order to really flesh out a factual record so that we can, if we want, take the case thereafter and revisit that factual record. So I would say on the one hand, if they had such an overwhelming appetite, they were starving to really expand presidential power, what the Supreme Court could have done is they could have said, look, procedural niceties aside, we understand that ordinarily these kind of preliminary rulings, a temporary restraining order that is set to expire on February 26th, ordinarily are not appealable, but dang it, we want to overturn Humphrey's executor case. We want to expand presidential power right now, and we don't like the fact that, we're bound by that and that the president's, powers are being unduly restricted in our supreme judgment. They could have taken it, and that would have been a really dangerous indicator, I think, for the rule of law and for the health of American democracy. So we can read something from them not immediately going there and saying, no, we're going to follow the normal course, and when and if we decide the case, which has been resolved in the trial court and gone through the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals in D.C., is ripe for us to review it, that is when we will review it in the normal course of business. So what I will say is this is more on the good news end of the spectrum than it is on the bad news end of the spectrum.
Well, let me take that a step further and just kind of ask you to predict the future here. Do you think that the Supreme Court does have an appetite to do something like this, to give Trump what he wants here as it relates to Humphrey's executor? Because we've seen them kind of defer to him in the past. We've seen them, despite their promises that stare decisis is sacrosanct, that they would never seek to overturn settled law. They did exactly that with Roe versus Wade, and then of course, as it relates to presidential immunity, they created that out of whole cloth in deference to Trump. Meanwhile, as it relates to Section 3 of the 14th Amendment and the insurrection clause, they decided that despite that being in the Constitution, that it somehow doesn't apply to Trump. So we have seen these justices rewrite the Constitution because it goes to the political advantage of Trump. And so do you presume that they would be willing to do the same thing here?
I fear they will. I suspect they will. and I thank you for saving me some legal analysis because you're exactly right, I would have pointed to as a basis for my opinion that I fear and suspect they will expand presidential power and beat down Congress's ability to install some reasonable checks and balances on what should be largely non-political or bipartisan appointments like internal watchdogs over executive branch corruption. I would have pointed to the presidential immunity ruling and the 14th Amendment ruling where they seem to either ignore or contradict, they being the right-wing bloc of the Supreme Court, either ignored or contradicted the express terms of the Constitution to bestow more powers and benefits on Donald Trump. So, if I had to lay my max $1 bet, I would probably say, one, they will accept some case involving a termination by Donald Trump of a government official, and I think they will probably overrule Humphrey's executor precedent and expand presidential powers, which at this moment in our nation's history, given what Donald Trump is doing, it's all about chaos, it's all about cruelty, it's all about aligning with dictators around the globe. There really is nothing more dangerous than expanding presidential power when this is the president who will be the beneficiary of that expanded power.
And the irony, of course, is that if a Democrat was in office looking to do any of this, all of these Republicans and likely these Republican justices on the court would be up in arms at the prospect of these dictatorial tendencies of a Democratic president. They called Barack Obama a dictator for signing executive orders at the beginning of his term, even though he signed fewer executive orders than George W. Bush and Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton and Ronald Reagan and all of these presidents before him. But when a Democrat does something that even could be perceived as aggregating too much power in the executive branch, all of a sudden the sirens go off and we hear about it nonstop. But when a president quite literally tries to aggregate all of the power in the federal government, even usurping power from the legislative branch, even usurping power from the judicial branch, suddenly it's not just crickets from these Republicans, because that would be bad enough. But you see these Republicans on the Supreme Court, these Republican justices, actually bend over backwards to help him, to give him exactly what he wants, even though doing so basically takes power away from them and gives it all to Donald Trump. These are people. This is like the grass cheering on the lawnmower in this instance, because you would think that all of these separate branches of government would have some vested interest in trying to jealously guard their own power and their own autonomy, and yet the legislative branch isn't doing it. The judicial branch isn't doing it. Everybody is so taken by either fear of Donald Trump or just this innate desire to kowtow to him that everybody is willing to rewrite our entire system of government all in deference to him.
Yeah, and it's tough to understand how the legislative branch will lay down and let Donald Trump walk all over them. The recent Kash Patel confirmation vote,
right.
Only 2 Republicans stood up for their constituents, for the safety of the American people. And it's also hard to see how not the whole federal judiciary, the judicial branch of government, but that rot at the top, that handful of radical right Supreme Court justices are even willing to give their own power away to Donald Trump by bestowing on him the power of lawlessness, absolute immunity, so he could literally do anything he damn well pleases to Supreme Court justices, and provided it was part of his core constitutional functions, he couldn't be held accountable criminally. None of this makes any damn sense.
Well, we will, of course, stay on top of this case as it continues to work its way through the court. So for those who are watching right now, if you want to follow along, again, this is very important right now and will have major implications moving forward. Please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on this screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.